Our next speaker, Stas. Today we'll talk about CSS properties. You know, it's not the thing that we are using a lot on our projects. That's why it's really interesting to hear from Stas about his experience. Please welcome Stas Gavrylov and CSS Properties Talk.
Hi, everyone. Do you hear me well? Do you hear me okay? Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to... 1 second. How about now? Better? Okay. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for taking over the React Kyiv meetups and gathering us all here and allowing us to hear such amazing talks as the previous one. I hope this tradition will keep going. So, my name is Stas. I work at Rails Reactor. Some of you may know us. For those who don't yet, we are a software company with great family culture, lots of perks, and tons of interesting people. We also host meetup tonight events. So if you're interested in software talks like this one, please come take us visit. And as for my today's topic, the talk is called Enhancing Your Apps with CSS Custom Properties. First of all, I would like to ask you to raise a hand if you have heard of CSS Custom Properties at first. How many of you? And now, please raise a hand if you use them in your everyday job. Okay, so I believe that this topic will be quite of interest for you. Well, why did I choose this topic beforehand? Today, the interfaces as front-end goes on and evolves, the interfaces that we build become increasingly more and more complex. And every customer wants to have the sexiest UI possible, and they want everything dynamic, everything moving on the page. And I believe this is the ideal web page in the eyes of any customer today. As it turns out, CSS, making this dynamic, adding it to your applications, is not that easy. CSS in general is quite a complex language. Unfortunately, not every developer thinks so, and most of us, to be honest, end up after learning some basics of the language and do not dig deeper in it. And when JavaScript developers encounter any complex problems with styling that they don't know how to solve with regular CSS, well, what do? They try to solve it with JavaScript, right, as any other problem. Well, because of this, we now have over 50 different solutions according to this link with different metrics and comparisons of performance for CSS in JS. You probably know about this topic, heard of it before. Personally, for me, it never clicked, and I have 3 issues with this approach. First of all, CSS is not a concise language. So when you start putting all your styling as well as the business logic in the same file, it grows quite big. I personally tend to keep my files not as large as possible, but as you can see here, it's a simple example from the most popular CSS and JS package, style components. It takes 15 lines to build a simple button, and you know that complex UIs will have much more stylings, several hundreds of lines of CSS, that's for sure. Well, it turns in the end in such a file that after printing would end up in something like this, with tons and tons of pages of code just for a rather complex styled component with CSS and JS in the same file. The second issue which I have with CSS and JS is that we were constantly told until a couple years ago that we should separate logic from presentation. And now, if we start mixing it together, you get your styling spread all across the application. Well, you either have, if you choose CSS and JS, put everything in JS now, forget about CSS as well, or it will be quite hard to find where was this property set or where was that property set, in CSS or in JS. So it gets all pretty mixed and messed up. The third issue that I have that is, well, I believe that if you can do something natively, you should try first do it natively without adding extra unnecessary, probably, tools for the problem. And CSS custom properties allow us to solve lots and lots of problems that CSS in JS approach tries to solve, but it's a native solution implemented in every modern browser. If you are blessed enough to not support IE 11, you can use it freely. It works like charm. I tested it personally. If you do need to support IE 11, you can still use CSS custom properties for static stylings with the add, I believe the last rows do not see this link well. I will post my slides later, don't worry. You can use post CSS custom properties plugin to at least convert your custom properties to normal colors, normal values after post-processing them, and with this you could easily start introducing them in your code base as well. When you drop IE, you can switch them without any plugins. As you can see, the first public draft of this technology, of this approach, was introduced in 2012, over 7 years ago, and you see lots of people in this room haven't even heard of it before. And that's a shame, I believe, but I do not blame it on you. It's just an overall not so high interest of JavaScript community in CSS. Starting from 2015, this feature is available in Chrome and Firefox, so for a pretty long time you could have been using it. For those who did not read or hear about custom properties before, here's a quick primer. Basically, what custom properties are. You can also hear the name of CSS variables in general, because basically this is how you use them. So I will be changing these terms. I will be using these terms interchangeably. You can set any variable as a property name if you prefix it with 2 dashes in the beginning on any selector and all, and this property can store any value that you could normally have in CSS property. You can set these custom variables either on any normal selectors like this one, ID or class or whatever, or you can set them as global variables on this root selector, which corresponds to your document element, HTML tag. And to use them, the variable in any other property, you should use the var function. You call it with the name of the property itself, and you will get the value that is stored in this variable. The coolest thing is that you can use the var function inside any other function, like calc, which is also, if you don't use calc, you should start immediately. Also another awesome feature to build complex UIs, and maybe linear gradient or any other property, basically. I hope everyone sees this line, but basically if you pass the second argument to var function, it will be used as a default value if the initial variable is not set. So in this case, if we don't have dynamic color variable available here, we will be having white color in the end of our gradient. Unfortunately, not everything is possible with CSS custom properties. If you take a closer look at this example, you can see that I'm trying to store another function as a custom property, and this function uses another variable which is not declared at the same selector. The variable tilt angle is declared on another class which tries to use tilted gradient custom property as its background image. So in an ideal world, this function would read the value of tilt angle from the class, and well, this whole gradient will appear on your screen. Unfortunately, this does not work like this because, first of all, it's CSS, right? We have cascade, we have scoping for custom properties, but they do not, like in JavaScript, you do not see local variables from the top, right? Because this variable tilt angle is not declared on the root element, the value of tilted gradient is calculated before it is passed down. So since it does not have a necessary value in here, it will not be visible at all. But there is always a solution. You can, instead of providing a default global variable like this one, you can use any selector, asterisk, or provide a special class which you will have to add to the element where you want to use this gradient, for example, variable. And in such case, because we have all selector here, it will be available to this class as well, and to any other element in your application. I'm not saying that this is the best practice, but this is just kind of one of a way to deal with them. It will be available to the element with tilted class as well. Second. Well, this is it for the theory, and now a couple of demos. So I try to show you them better. The first one is tilted gradient. Do you see the code well? I hope. So if you take a look at the CSS first, this CSS is self-contained. It means that all what is necessary for displaying the gradient on the right is declared in here. We have this linear gradient function. We have a tilt angle variable that we want to use, but if you don't have it, we will use the default value of 90. Also, do not forget that if you work with integer values in calc and you want to use it in any other function that expects not an integer, but for example a degree unit like this one, you will have to multiply it by a unit necessary. And we use this gradient variable as a background for the div on the right. You might have noticed that I haven't yet tell a word about React in general in this topic, right? But this is React Kyiv in the end. Well, it turns out it is very easy to start introducing dynamic to all of this and to start working with custom variables from your JSX code. Basically, all that you need is style tag and pass in their object with value of the variable you want to declare and to pass to the element itself. Don't forget to put quotes around, because this is not a valid key for the object, of course. And in this demo, I have a simple input of type range. This is an integer input with values between 0 and 180, and on every change it sets the value of the range in state, and I pass the angle value as a custom property. I want to remind you that this is vanilla CSS and React, no preprocessors, no CSS in JS. And so when we start moving this range, it dynamically and very quickly updates your view. So this is one of the ways to use it. My demos today are mostly experiments. I'm not saying that they will fit all your needs, but I encourage you to experiment with them on your own. I was also told that not every one of them, for example, works on Windows, but still, I think you can find workarounds for it. The second demo that I want to show you is custom themes. Lots of use cases for CSS in JS, for example, mentions theming of your applications. And again, I would like to start from the styling. In this demo, we have two default variables for the colors that we will be using on our root selector. We also have a container class which wraps this structure that has its own two variables for font color and background color, and we use default values for them in the beginning, and we use these variables like font color and background color in the properties of the elements themselves. Well, I have an RGB component here, which also shows a couple of strategies of working with custom variables. First of all, if you want to read the value of custom variable from your CSS in JS6, you should call window get computed style method with the element that you want to read the styles from, and then on receipt object call get property value method with the name of the variable itself. So we will have the color in here. After this, I set these default colors read from CSS to state. Unfortunately, these two color inputs do not reflect from start the value that I need, but it can be because they are basically default browser inputs. But of course, if you replace them with any other element displaying your color, they should work fine. And on the bottom here, I have this RGB container where I will try to override the font color and background color with the values from the state, which by default contain my default variables from here, I remind you. A bit below, I have two inputs of type color, which on every change returns you an RGB value. And on every change, I update my state with the color of the value. And so if I start changing the colors in here, I can easily change the background and the font, for example, and this will be updated instantly in real time. Another use case for the variables as well is predefined theming. For example, I have here a select with a couple of themes predefined, and in my styles file, I have provided two themes that if my container will have a brown class, then I use these variables. If I have a blue class, then I use these variables. And so if I start changing my themes, I have to use important here because previously I have set inline variables on RGB element, right? So I have to override the specificity. By the way, the specificity of CSS is also included, right, for these properties. But basically, this is a way of providing themes in advance. The last example in this demo is called HSL. So this component uses not RGB colors, but hex color. And if you ever worked with HSL function, which is an analog to RGB function, but it takes the value of color or hue as an integer number, and then the saturation and luminosity, you can build quite interesting themes based on the single value. In here, I have a variable of theme hue. I have three other variables which contain HSLA functions based on the theme. So normal will have saturation of 50%, lighter color have higher saturation, and darker color has lower saturation. And all of this depends on a single theme hue variable. In my component, I also have, again, input type color and a couple of helper functions that convert RGB color to hex. And now, if with the help of this one input color, I can easily change the theming of all my apps. So basically, if you build your theme around these gradients, it can be very convenient to rule all of them in just a single place by changing the hue of your color. The last theme, the last demo, sorry, that I wanted to show you is called Stack. This is like a prototype of the component I been building on my current project, and the component itself is basically a stack of cards. So this is a stack component. If it does not have any cards in it, this is a simple card, 200 by 200 in here. If it has several of them, the underlying cards should be placed on the bottom and stick out a little bit. And on hover, they also stick out a little bit. And the green border in here shows the border of the container, because if you can imagine how you would do it, you would have to absolutely position these cards under the bottom one, but when you use absolute position, the elements are taken out of page context, and they would not affect the width of the container. So, if we first take a look at the styles of this component, I tried to move as much styles as possible to the variables. For example, this card size contains a value of length of one side of this card. I can very easily change it, and card size is the base for lots of other parts in this component. Like, for example, card shift, the size that card sticks out when you when there are more than one is 1/10. For example, I can change it to 1/5 or 1/7. Animation style is here just for the convenience of reusing it. The size of the container itself, as you could see, is calculated by multiplying, by summing the size of regular card if you don't have any underlying cards, so it's also 200 pixels, plus the value of our shift, how far the cards pick out, multiplied by the size of the stack. And we don't see the size of the stack declared anywhere in here, because I can easily pass the size from the component itself. This is the code for the component. It basically takes the single property, and we pass this the size of the stack as a value to our container to effectively calculate the necessary width. And in here we build an array of the same divs, and we can very easily provide an index property, which is quite useful if, for example, we think how far should we put this second card on the bottom, right? It's very easy to calculate the offset for any card if we just use its index and multiply it by the card shift that we have in here. So with this combination of a bit of JavaScript and a bit of CSS, we get this pretty interesting dynamic component, which still has all of its properties. I mean, the dimensions. It affects all the sibling elements on the page, and allows you to build more complex interfaces. A couple of links in the end. Basically, the first three are different articles which I recommend you to read from Smashing Magazine. The last one is MDN link and general practices for working with custom properties. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Stas, for great talk. It's really amazing how many things you can do now with just a pure CSS.
Yeah.
Guys, do you have questions to Stas?
Hi, thank you for your talk. Could you tell, please, what kind of values do you usually put in your CSS custom properties in your everyday work?
First of all, the indexes, like in the last example, because it's useful to know what is if you have lots of sibling elements on one level, useful to know like what is their position in the container. Also, I'm recently started diving deeper in CSS grids, so it's an awesome feature to provide the size of your grid, for example. If you know how many items your container takes, you can easily say that the grid size is, let's say, 10, for example, and you will have instantly the grid of the size you need. I'm not using the colors as I have shown here, but it's just another way to think about them. So it's basically there are unlimited ways to use them. Just as I was heading to this meetup, I've seen that there's a new article on CSS tricks about using Boolean logic in with CSS variables. So I think this topic will be evolving, and we'll soon see a lot more interesting examples.
Thank you.
Thank you. One more question. Could you compare CSS custom properties and SAS? Or CSS, what is the better? Because I think the same problems can be resolved by SAS. And why CSS custom properties is better?
As far as I know, you cannot dynamically set SAS variables, right? And this is the biggest feature for them, personally, for me. If you use them only as static values, if you support older browsers, yeah, there's probably no difference, and you can. But I would still start integrating it now, because in future, when you, as I said before, when you drop older browsers, you can fully use all the possibilities like dynamic styling that they provide.
And one more question. For using CSS custom styles in React application, you have to use inline styles for React components. As I know, inline styles for React components, it's not best practice.
Well, I personally take this approach of not trying to optimize anything if it works fine, right? You know, until you encounter any performance drops, you should be fine with this. Well, there is no other way, unfortunately, to dynamically update anything, so you have to trade something. In my case, that was a perfect trading.
Do you have performance problem?
No. I even I usually test my apps with 4 to 6 CPU slowdown. You know, Chrome allows that, and everything works perfectly fine.
Okay, thank you. More questions?
In CSS variables, it's not allowed to use their values as media queries.
Yeah, this is correct. I forgot to mention that. As of now, you can only use them as parts of other properties. So media query is not a property itself, right? But as far, if I'm not mistaken, the next level of the specification will allow to use custom properties in media queries as well. It's not here yet, but I believe in future it will be available.
It's just interesting. Have you any common solution for this dynamically?
Well, if you build your styles around the variables in the beginning, the only thing that you will have to change in your media query is the values of the variables themselves, and the rest of the app will be styled automatically. So this is another great feature, I believe.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Stas.
Thank you.